Suzanne Chandler had lived in her parents' house for 9 years. Not because she couldn't afford to leave. Not because she was lazy or stuck, or failing at adulthood the way people sometimes assumed when they heard, still lives with her parents at 34. She stayed because it made sense. She was a data analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm downtown. She paid rent every single month like clockwork. She covered her share of groceries and utilities. And the arrangement let her save aggressively for a down payment on a house of her own. Her parents, Diane and Robert Chandler, had always framed it as a partnership. "We're building something together," her mother used to say. "You're not a guest here, Suzanne. You're an investment in this family." Suzanne believed that for a long time. She believed it through the years of rent increases that always seemed to track suspiciously close to her raises at work, as if her mother had access to her pay stubs, which, Suzanne would later realize she did, because Suzanne had once let her parents help set up direct deposit on a shared family banking app during a phone upgrade, and never quite gotten around to removing their access. She believed it through the holidays where her younger brother Marcus was toasted for his entrepreneurial spirit, while her own promotions were mentioned almost as an afterthought. She believed it right up until the afternoon in March when a loan officer named Priya Osei called her apologetically to explain why her mortgage pre-approval had been denied. "There's a discrepancy in your file," Priya had said. "A personal loan account opened in your name, originated 4 years ago, current balance just under $38,000. It's showing 31 missed payments over the last 18 months. Miss Chandler, this loan has taken your credit score down almost 200 points." Suzanne remembered sitting very still in her car in the parking lot of her office building, engine running, AC blasting cold air she could no longer feel. "I don't have a personal loan," she said. "I've never had a personal loan." According to the documentation on file, it was originated at Ridgeline Community Bank, Priya said. "Co-signed. Your signature is on the application." Suzanne had not been inside a Ridgeline Community Bank branch in her life. To understand how Suzanne got to that parking lot, you have to understand the Chandler family's particular flavor of dysfunction. The kind that doesn't look like dysfunction from the outside because it wears the costume of closeness. Robert Chandler had spent 31 years as a shift supervisor at a regional distribution center before retiring on a modest pension. Diane Chandler had worked part-time as a school administrative assistant and had, for as long as Suzanne could remember, functioned as the family's unofficial CFO. The one who handled the money, who kept the checkbook, who later kept the spreadsheets, who eventually kept the passwords. Marcus, 2 years younger than Suzanne, had always been the golden child in the particular way that middle children of ambition sometimes are. Not because he achieved more but because he needed more, and need in the Chandler household was mistaken for potential. Marcus dropped out of a marketing degree at 22 to focus on building something real. What he built, over the following decade, was a rotating cast of businesses. An e-commerce store selling phone accessories that lasted 8 months, a social media growth consultancy that lasted a year, a food truck that lasted a summer, and finally, the venture that would consume everything. BC Peak Marketing, a digital ad agency Marcus launched when he was 30, promising to bring enterprise-level strategy to small businesses at scale. Suzanne had watched all of it from the sidelines with the particular exhaustion of an older sibling who has learned not to say what she's thinking. She'd watched her parents co-sign Marcus's first business loan for the phone accessory store. She'd watched them quietly absorb the debt when it collapsed. She'd watched her mother describe each failure not as a failure but as a learning experience, and each of Suzanne's stable, boring, competent successes. The promotion to senior analyst, the certification she earned on nights and weekends, the raise that finally broke 6 figures. With a kind of polite nod before the conversation swung back inevitably to Marcus and whatever he was building now. Suzanne told herself it didn't matter. She had her own life. She had a job she was good at, a small circle of close friends, a habit of hiking on Sundays, a 5-year plan that she updated every January in a spreadsheet of her own, one her mother had never seen. She told herself the rent she paid, currently $1,050 a month for the finished basement apartment with its own entrance, was simply a smart financial decision, a bridge to homeownership, nothing more. Then in January her mother sat her down at the kitchen table. "We need to talk about the rent," Diane said, sliding a printed spreadsheet across the table the way she might present a project timeline at work. Suzanne recognized her mother's font choices immediately. Diane always used Calibri, always bolded the totals. The new number was $1,900. That's almost double, Suzanne said. It's market rate for the area, Diane said. We looked it up. Mom, this isn't a market rate unit. It's your basement. It has a separate entrance. A full kitchen. In-unit laundry. Suzanne, if you rented this on the open market you'd be paying more, not less. Suzanne sat with that for a moment, doing the math in her head, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach. Not suspicion yet, just discomfort, the sense of a floor tilting a few degrees under her feet. Why now? She asked. Why the sudden jump? Her mother's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward the hallway that led to the garage, where Robert was tinkering with something he didn't need to be tinkering with. Your father and I have some expenses coming up, Diane said. Nothing you need to worry about. We just need the household to be more self-sufficient. Household, Suzanne repeated. Mom, I'm not the household. I'm your adult daughter paying you rent. Don't be dramatic. Suzanne didn't sign anything that day. She said she needed time to think about whether she could make the new number work, which was true, but underneath that practical concern was something else, something she wouldn't fully name for another 2 months. The beginning of an instinct that something didn't add up. It was Robert, oddly, who cracked the door open. Not intentionally and not because he meant to betray anything. Robert Chandler was not a schemer. He was, if anything, the more oblivious half of the marriage. A man who trusted his wife's handling of the family finances so completely that he'd once gone 11 months without checking a single bank statement. 3 weeks after the rent conversation, Suzanne came home from work to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of mail, looking lost in a way she'd never seen him look before. Bills mostly. A few envelopes stamped past due in red. One from Ridgeline Community Bank marked urgent. Response required. Dad? You okay? Robert looked up at her and for a second, just a second, something in his face was almost pleading. Then he caught himself the way he always did and folded the moment back into calm. Just paperwork, he said. Your mother handles all this. But Suzanne had already seen the sender on the top envelope. BC Peak Marketing. Notice of default. A business loan notice addressed to Marcus but forwarded to the house. She didn't say anything that night. She went down to her basement apartment, closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The next weekend she found the second thread, the one that would eventually unravel everything. Her mother had asked her to grab the printer paper from the office. A converted spare bedroom that had, over the years, become Diane's command center, the place where she paid bills, filed insurance claims, and apparently ran a much larger operation than Suzanne had ever suspected. Suzanne opened the desk drawer looking for paper and instead found a folder, unlabeled, tucked behind the ream. Inside was a printed loan application from Ridgeline Community Bank. Cosigner, Suzanne M. Chandler. A signature at the bottom that was unmistakably meant to be hers, the right first initial flourish, the right slant, and just as unmistakably was not hers. Suzanne had signed her name enough times in her life to know her own hand, the particular way she looped the Z, the flat cross of her T. This signature was close. Close enough to pass a glance. Not close enough to survive scrutiny. The loan amount, $38,000. The stated purpose, business expansion, BC Peak Marketing. The date, 4 years earlier. Suzanne sat down on the office floor with the folder in her lap and read it 3 times before the shape of it became fully real to her. 4 years ago. She remembered that period vaguely. It was around the time Marcus had been expanding into new verticals, around the time her mother had asked her, almost casually, to sign a form for the house insurance. At the kitchen table, quickly, no context. The way Diane often had her sign things without much explanation because Suzanne trusted her mother's competence in these matters completely. She hadn't read what she signed that day. She'd been in a hurry, late for something, and her mother had said, "It's routine, don't worry about it." And Suzanne had signed without reading, the way you do with a parent who has never given you a reason not to trust her. Except, this wasn't the form Suzanne remembered signing. This signature was different from that one, subtly, the pressure and slant not quite matching. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Suzanne had unknowingly co-signed a business loan for her brother believing it was something else entirely, or her mother had forged her signature outright, using that real, once legitimate signature as a template. Suzanne closed the folder, put it back exactly where she'd found it, and went back to her room to sit with the second, more frightening possibility, that this wasn't the only document. That if her mother had done this once quietly for years ago, there was no reason to believe she'd stopped. Suzanne didn't confront anyone. Not yet. She had learned over 34 years in this family that confrontation without proof was simply an invitation for her concerns to be reframed, softened, explained away. You're misunderstanding. You're overreacting. This is a family matter, Suzanne, not a courtroom. She needed proof first. Then and only then would there be a conversation. She requested her full credit reports from all 3 bureaus that weekend. Something she realized with a small jolt of shame she hadn't done in almost 2 years, having assumed her financial life was simple enough not to require close monitoring. When the reports came back, the Ridgeline loan was there in black and white on all 3, exactly as Priya Osei would later describe it to her on the phone. $38,000, 31 missed payments, a delinquency history stretching back a year and a half. Her score, which she'd last checked around 780, now sat at 601. She sat with the number for a long time. 601. The number that would, weeks later, cost her a mortgage pre-approval on the first home she'd ever tried to buy on her own. She pulled her bank statements next, going back years, looking for anything she might have missed. Transfers, authorizations, anything that might explain how $38,000 of debt had been quietly hung around her name without a single payment ever touching her own accounts. She found nothing there which told her something important. The money hadn't come to her and hadn't been paid by her. It had gone somewhere else entirely, and someone else had been responsible for payments that had, at some point roughly 18 months ago, simply stopped. She began quietly documenting everything. Screenshots of the credit reports, a photo of the folder's contents taken on a day her parents were out, a timeline she built in a private spreadsheet with a password her mother didn't know. She was an analyst. This was, in its own bleak way, the kind of work she was built for. Assemble the data. Let the pattern speak for itself. The pattern, once assembled, was ugly. BC Peak Marketing had taken on debt across at least 3 separate instruments over 4 years. A small business line of credit in Marcus's name alone, which had gone to collections. A personal loan in Robert's name, co-signed presumably with his knowledge, which was being paid barely month to month. And the Ridgeline loan in Suzanne's name, which, as far as Suzanne could determine, she had never authorized, never seen the funds from, and never been told existed. The rent increase, she now understood, was not a market rate correction. It was $850 a month extra funneled, she would come to learn, directly into a joint account her mother used to keep BC Peak Marketing's collapsing finances from imploding entirely. Suzanne had, unknowingly, been paying down her brother's failed business for 2 months before she'd even found the folder. The call from Priya Osei landed on a Thursday in March, 3 days after Suzanne had submitted her own mortgage pre-approval application. An application she'd been planning for over a year, for a modest 3-bedroom bungalow 40 minutes outside the city, the first real marker of the independent life she'd been quietly building despite everything. "I have to be honest with you, Ms. Chandler," Priya had said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone who delivered this kind of news often enough to have softened around the edges of it. "This account is going to be a serious obstacle. I'd recommend disputing it if you believe it isn't yours, but that process can take time, and in the meantime I can't move forward with your pre-approval as submitted." Suzanne thanked her, hung up, and sat in the parking lot until her hands stopped shaking. That night she didn't go down to the basement. She went straight to the kitchen table, folder in hand, credit reports printed and stapled, and waited for her parents to come home from their weekly dinner with Marcus and his wife. A standing Thursday tradition Suzanne had, for the last several months, been quietly excluded from with vague excuses about, just a small thing, nothing formal. When Diane walked in and saw the folder on the table, something in her face changed before Suzanne said a single word. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a beat too long before she smiled. But Suzanne had spent 34 years learning to read her mother's face, and she recognized it instantly for what it was. Recognition. Not confusion. Recognition. "What is this?" Diane asked, setting her purse down slowly. "You tell me," Suzanne said. "I got a call today. From a bank. About a $38,000 loan with my name on it that I never signed for." Suzanne. 31 missed payments, Mom. My credit score dropped 200 points. I got denied for a mortgage pre-approval 3 days ago because of a loan I didn't even know existed. Robert had come in behind Diane, and Suzanne watched her father's face do something she'd never seen it do, go completely, genuinely blank with shock. Whatever was happening here, Suzanne understood in that instant. Her father hadn't known either. This was Diane's construction alone, or Diane and Marcus's. It's not what it looks like, Diane said, and Suzanne almost laughed because of course that was the first thing out of her mouth. Not I'm sorry, not let me explain, but the reflexive, practiced denial of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this moment in her head at some point and hoped it would never come. Then explain it, Suzanne said. Because what it looks like is that you forged my signature on a business loan for Marcus and let me pay it off through a rent increase you told me was market rate. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Suzanne counted it. For seconds, 5, 6, before her mother's shoulders dropped just slightly and the performance cracked. It was supposed to be temporary, Diane said. Marcus needed a bridge. The bank wouldn't approve the amount on his application alone, and your father and I had already stretched ourselves thin covering the line of credit. You had good credit. I thought, if we could just get through this one rough patch, the business would stabilize and we'd refinance it out of your name before it ever affected you. You thought, Suzanne repeated. You thought you could take out $38,000 in my name without telling me, and it would just quietly go away? I was trying to protect this family. You forged my signature. I was helping your brother. By stealing my identity. Diane flinched at the word, hard like it had physical weight. Don't say it like that. It's not the same thing. You're my daughter. This is family money, family stress, we were going to fix it. It's exactly the same thing, Suzanne said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady. A stranger who forges someone's signature on a loan application goes to prison. The only difference here is that you share my last name. What happened over the following 2 weeks would later strike Suzanne as the truest test of who her parents actually were, stripped of every softening context of family and tradition, and we're all we've got. Diane's first instinct, once the shock wore off, was not toward accountability. It was toward containment. We can fix this quietly, she told Suzanne 2 days later, having clearly spent the intervening time consulting someone. A lawyer, a friend, Suzanne never found out who, about damage control. Your father and I will refinance the loan into our names. We'll get you a letter for the credit bureaus. This doesn't need to become a bigger thing than it is. It's already a bigger thing than that, Suzanne said. I need this documented properly. I need it reported. Reported to who? The bank. The bureaus. Possibly the police. Diane's face went white. You are not calling the police on your own mother. I'm not calling the police on my mother, Suzanne said carefully. I'm reporting identity theft. What you did to that has a name, and it isn't a family disagreement. It was Robert, surprisingly, who spoke next, his voice low and rough in a way Suzanne had rarely heard from him. Diane, how long has this been going on? Diane didn't answer him directly, which was in its own way an answer. The offer came 4 days later, and it was, in Suzanne's memory, the moment that finally, completely dissolved whatever residual guilt she'd been carrying about, making this into a big deal. Diane sat her down again. Same kitchen table, same posture, as if the setting itself carried some authority, and proposed a solution. We'll add your name to the deed, she said. A quarter share of the house. In exchange, this stays inside the family. No police, no formal disputes with the bank naming us specifically. We'll say it was an administrative error, a paperwork mix-up. You get real equity, Suzanne. More than the loan is even worth. And we move forward. Suzanne looked at her mother for a long moment, genuinely searching one last time for some version of this woman who might actually understand what she'd done. She didn't find her. You want to buy my silence, Suzanne said, with a piece of the house I already live in for free rent I've been paying you for 9 years. That's not what this is. It's exactly what this is. And the fact that you think a deed share is an equivalent trade for fraud tells me you still don't understand what you did. Love is not a bill you pay to stay in a family, Mom, Suzanne said, and the words came out of her with a clarity she hadn't planned, something she'd apparently been assembling for weeks without realizing it. I'm not going to be quiet about this so the family's version of events stays comfortable. I already paid this family enough. I'm done paying for things I never agreed to. She stood up from the table, and for the first time in 9 years, she did not go back down to the basement to think it over. She went upstairs, packed an overnight bag and left for her friend Rachel's apartment that same night. The next morning, Suzanne called a lawyer, an actual one, not a family friend who knew a guy, a consumer protection attorney named Devin Marsh who specialized in identity theft cases. Devin walked her through the process with the kind of calm precision Suzanne desperately needed after weeks of chaos. File a police report, file a report with the FTC to generate a federal identity theft affidavit, submit formal disputes to all 3 credit bureaus with the affidavit and police report attached, notify Ridgeline Community Bank in writing that the account was fraudulent and demand it be investigated and removed, and place a fraud alert, later a full credit freeze, on her reports to prevent anything similar from happening again. Family fraud cases are some of the hardest emotionally and some of the easiest legally, Devin told her during their first call. Emotionally because you're up against decades of relationship history telling you to let it go. Legally because a forged signature is a forged signature. The bank doesn't care whose mother did it. Filing the police report was the hardest 20 minutes of Suzanne's life. Not because the officer was unkind, he was procedural, professional, entirely unbothered by the fact that the suspect was Suzanne's own mother, but because saying the words out loud in an official capacity made something real that Suzanne had spent weeks trying to hold at arm's length. My mother forged my signature on a loan application and used the proceeds to fund my brother's business. Once she'd said it to a police officer with a badge and a case number, there was no more room for reframing it as a misunderstanding. Ridgeline Community Bank's fraud investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, Suzanne learned things she hadn't known. That the loan had originally been used to cover a $22,000 shortfall in BC Peak Marketing's operating account after a major client contract fell through, and that the remaining funds had gone toward a growth marketing push that never generated the return Marcus had promised. She learned that her father had, separately, been making minimum payments on his own $15,000 loan tied to the business for over a year, quietly out of his pension, telling no one, not even Diane, the full extent of how much it had eaten into their retirement savings. She learned from her father in a phone call that was the most honest conversation the two of them had had in years, that he had genuinely not known about the Ridgeline loan until the night Suzanne confronted them. "Your mother handled things," Robert said, his voice tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I let her. That's on me too, Suzanne. I looked away because it was easier than looking at how bad it had gotten. I'm not going to pretend that makes me innocent." Suzanne appreciated the honesty more than she expected to. It didn't undo anything. But it was more than her mother had managed to offer. The bank's investigation ultimately confirmed what Suzanne already knew. The signature on the application did not match verified samples of her signature on file, and internal notes showed the loan had been processed by a since-terminated loan officer who had, it turned out, waived the usual in-person identity verification as a favor, a decision that was now the subject of its own separate internal review. Ridgeline removed the account from Suzanne's credit file entirely and issued a formal letter confirming the loan was fraudulent and had never been her legal obligation. Diane was never criminally charged. Devin had warned Suzanne this was a real possibility. Prosecutors were often reluctant to pursue family fraud cases where the victim ultimately just wanted the debt removed rather than a conviction, and Suzanne, in the end, chose not to push for criminal charges against her own mother, a decision she made with clear eyes rather than soft ones. It wasn't forgiveness. It was, she told Rachel late one night over wine, just choosing which fight I actually want to spend the next 2 years of my life on. I want my credit back. I don't need her in a courtroom to know what she did. By the time Suzanne's credit score climbed back above 750, 9 months later, after diligent monitoring, a secured card to rebuild active history, and the slow, boring work of simply waiting for time to do what time does, she had moved into her own apartment, a one-bedroom across town that cost more than the $1,900 her mother had once demanded, and felt, somehow, immeasurably lighter. Her relationship with her parents did not end, not entirely, but it changed shape completely. She spoke to her father regularly, coffee every other Sunday, a standing arrangement that felt, for the first time in years, uncomplicated. Their conversations were smaller now, quieter, built around actual interest in each other rather than the performance of family closeness. He had, in his own way, begun untangling himself from Diane's management of the household finances, insisting on seeing every statement now, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. Her relationship with her mother remained, a year later, largely unrepaired. Diane had sent 2 long emails over the months that followed. One defensive, insisting the whole ordeal had been blown out of proportion, and one much later, quieter, that came closer to an actual apology without ever fully arriving at one. Suzanne read both, replied to neither at length, and kept her credit reports locked down tight enough that nothing could touch them again without her knowledge. Marcus's business, BC Peak Marketing, folded 8 months after the confrontation at the kitchen table. He took a salaried marketing coordinator job at a mid-sized firm, the first steady paycheck he'd drawn in over a decade. Suzanne heard about it secondhand through her father, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication exactly, just a quiet, tired relief that the machine that had consumed so much of her family's money and trust had finally, simply stopped running. She bought her own house that following spring. The 3-bedroom bungalow she'd originally applied for, delayed by a year, financed on the strength of a credit history she had rebuilt entirely on her own terms, co-signed by no one, dependent on no one. She remembered standing in the empty living room on closing day, keys in her hand, and thinking about the folder she'd found behind the printer paper, about the 18 months of missed payments that had happened without her knowledge, about the $1,900 rent increase that had been, in the end, not a housing decision but the opening move of a much larger deception. She thought, too, about something Devon Marsh had told her near the end of the case, almost offhand, that had stuck with her longer than almost anything else from that whole ordeal. The families who survive this kind of thing intact, Devon said, are the ones who stop treating boundaries as betrayal. Most people think loyalty means absorbing whatever the family needs you to absorb. It doesn't. Sometimes loyalty to yourself is the only version of loyalty that actually protects everyone in the long run, even the people you're setting the boundary against. Suzanne didn't know if that was true for the Chandlers. She wasn't sure her mother would ever fully understand what she'd done, or why a deed share and a hushed apology hadn't been enough to make it disappear. But she knew what it had taught her, concretely, in a way she now repeated to anyone who'd listen, a small ritual of caution she'd adopted like a second skin. Check your full credit report from all 3 bureaus at least twice a year, regardless of how much you trust the people around you. Read what you sign, every single time, no matter who's handing you the pen. And remember that love, real love, doesn't come with a balance due. She kept a framed photo on her new mantle, not of her parents, not of Marcus, but of the closing documents from her house, the first major financial decision of her adult life that belonged entirely, unambiguously to her. Underneath it, on a small card she'd written herself in the weeks after everything had finally settled, was a single line she'd once said out loud at a kitchen table to a mother who hadn't understood it yet and maybe never would. Love is not a bill you pay to stay. It had cost her 9 years, $38,000 she never owed, and a relationship with her mother that would likely never fully heal, to learn that lesson. She had no intention of ever unlearning it.